Want to know if the Meikon underwater camera housing for the Sony A7 II range is the right housing for you? Stick around. Hey, I'm Paul from Below the Waterline, and if you're into scuba diving gear, training and travel, then put some pressure on the subscribe button and descend in that dive bell to make sure you get notifications about new videos. The camera I use most often is a Sony A7S II, and so I wanted to get hold of Meikon and test out this underwater housing specifically for that camera. The first thing I did is replace that lens housing with the dome port housing. All you need to do is unscrew a lock on the inside of the housing, and then you can twist and release. Once I'd set up the dome port, I filled the bath and I put the housing into the bath to make sure that it was sealed and there weren't any leaks. I was looking for anything like air bubbles that would be coming out. There is also an alarm system built into the housing. If there's any leak in there and you get a bit of water into the housing, it'll start to beep and flash and let you know that you've got a leak. So if you open that up, there is a little battery in there. It's actually sealed by a piece of plastic which has been heat sealed over the top of the battery, and that means that you would need to put a new battery in, put a piece of plastic over it, and then hold it over the heat of the stove and shrink wrap that plastic around it. It works really well. You can see that just with a little bit of liquid, and there's a red flashing light and a beep. And once that dries out, the beeping stops. When you take your camera out into the water, there's actually a flashing red light when you're filming with a Sony A7S II. And so I was quite concerned that the alarm was going off, and I hadn't tested it yet, so I didn't realize that there was both an audible and a light alarm. That's going to be the key thing, is to recognize the difference for the light of the alarm compared to the recording red light that flashes on your Sony A7S II. I then put the camera into the housing and I put it back into the bath to see how it was balanced, and I could see immediately that the very large air pocket in the dome port made the front end of the housing flip up, and so it wasn't very well balanced. What I did was set up a cage at the bottom over here so that I could attach a weight to that cage and start to try and balance the weight out. At the moment, with a 1 kilo lead weight attached to the bottom, it's negatively balanced, but it is actually very well balanced. If I tip the camera up and let it go, it'll slip back into a balanced neutral position. It is, however, negatively buoyant, so you need to control the buoyancy using your own jacket. The next thing that I did is I took this to a pool. I put a bit of tissue paper into the housing without the camera in, and I took this down to the bottom of a 5-meter pool just to make sure that at depth it wasn't actually going to leak. It performed well, there weren't any leaks, and so I brought it to the surface, put my camera in, and fingers crossed, I took the first plunge with the camera in. It worked really well. There are controls on this housing for almost all the functions on the Sony A7 II range. One of the things I did notice is that you'd only be able to control the dial on the back, which I then set to my aperture setting. The shutter speed, which is normally set on my 4-finger dial, I wasn't able to use. There is no dial on the housing. That means you need to set your frame rate at the beginning of the dive, set your shutter speed to 2 times that frame rate as per the 180-degree rule, and then only control your aperture through the course of the dive. This Meikon housing doesn't have a push button on top of the mode dial. The Sony A7S II has a push button on the top of its mode dial, and so you'll need to set your camera to either automatic or manual before you go diving. Your Sony A7 II doesn't have a push button on top of the mode dial, and so you'll be able to control the mode underwater. The rest of the functions are almost all available. You can see the LCD screen through this. What I suggest you do is set that to manual, and so that you've got your LCD screen on, and you set it on its brightest mode so that you can see your LCD screen throughout the dive. The other thing that I did is I put a retractable coil lanyard onto that, which I clipped onto my BCD. Just because this setup at the moment is negatively buoyant, I don't want to let go of the camera and it drops into the abyss. I've made a review video of that A7Sii coil lanyard. I'll put a link to that video over here. There is also a plug for a trigger at the top of the camera over here, which has a screw tight just to seal that off when you're not using it. I don't have any kind of trigger for this camera, so I'm not using it at all. There is also a mount over there for a strobe. The things that I still need to review are taking this to a depth of 20 or 30 meters. At the moment, I've only taken it into a pool which was around 5 meters deep. It performed very well, and I'll have to give you an update as we go. One of the things that I've done now is to put this housing onto a tray, which you can attach using these 2 1/4-inch screws on the base plate of the housing. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to use LED flashing, which is normally used to channel water away from windows and walls on your roof. And I'll position that around the housing using Velcro so that I can adjust the LED weighting around the housing and make sure that the housing is very neutrally and evenly balanced no matter what position it's in. On this stabilizing tray, you'll be able to attach strobes or video lights here and here. The price of this housing is around $400 US, which means that it's on the budget range of underwater camera housings for the Sony A7 II range. If you wanted to upgrade that housing, you'd be looking at CNC, Arclight or Nauticam housing, and that price will range from the budget $400 all the way to around $2,500–3,000 US, depending on the particular system that you want to get set up. If you want to take a look at the current price for this housing on Amazon, I'll leave a link in the description. So let's talk lenses. The lens that I use is a 16 to 70mm zoom lens. When I put that lens into the housing with its standard port, I found that there was a very strong vignette around the image. Upgrading to a dome port is an absolute necessity if you want to get slightly wider angle lenses. The internal dimensions of this port are 8 centimeters or 3 inches wide on the lens, and around 10 centimeters or 4 inches from the body of the camera to the inside of the dome lens. I'll be diving to a maximum of 30 meters or around 100 feet using this housing. I wouldn't want to push it too much deeper than that because the maximum depth limit of this housing is around 40 meters or around 130 feet. Towards the end of an hour of filming underwater, the Sony A7S II was showing a heat temperature warning light. In other reviews, people have mentioned that the camera does start to reach its temperature limits, and if there's any moisture inside the camera housing, that moisture will start to form condensation on the inside of the lens. What I normally do is to blow air from my cylinder into the housing before I seal it. Air from your cylinder is going to be dry compressed air, which means that it'll force out most of the moisture in the housing before you seal it. Of course, it's good practice to also use a moisture absorbing tab inside the housing whenever you go diving. I think that this is a fantastic entry-level underwater camera housing. If you're just getting started in underwater photography or videography, this is a fantastic underwater housing to get started with. I'd be reluctant to spend $2,000 or $3,000 on a top-of-the-range underwater housing before I know that this is something that I'm going to continue with. So if you're into scuba diving, gear, training and travel, then put some pressure on the subscribe button, descend in that dive bell to make sure you get notifications about the next video, and check out the next video here.